the Lord said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell or Hades or will not prevail against it. We have to understand that he was not saying, I will build my organization.
The move to liturgical Christianity, today on In the Shadow of the Cross. Welcome back to In the Shadow of the Cross. I am Loren Rosser, and once again I'm joined by my friends Jim Durkin.
Hello.
And we have a special guest today. Genghis Khan is here with us. It's becoming a thing now to see what name Michael picks for every week. And when I saw he picked that name, I said, "Well, you got a lot of kids." And he said, also a lot of rats.
Wrath, like the Wrath of Khan.
Wrath, yes, wrath. I said rats. I was thinking the plague.
No, yeah, right.
Well, that too.
Exactly. So, I mean, it was accurate, but it was a different comment. Okay. I real quick, I have to go down this bunny trail. I saw this meme that just killed me. It's really cool when people stand in front of things they destroy. It had like the Joker from Batman with the hospital blowing up behind him, and had some Arnold Schwarzenegger in front of some building blowing up, and then it had a rat in front of Europe. So anyway, I'm a history nerd. But
I'll do you another one.
What's that?
The best meme I saw this week shows this Thomas Kincaid painting. I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Kincaid, but he jigsaw puzzles, and they're just these wintry, fluffy, sleepy, wonderful, beautiful, right scenes.
Yeah.
And the top it says "How to Destroy a Thomas Kincaid Painting." It shows this house in this valley, and it's all beautiful and the twinkly lights, and then Godzilla.
I love those. I absolutely love those because it was a whole fad going on for a while where they put in like Star Wars spaceships, and so they had like the beautiful little cottage, and then there was one of the big old walkers, coming through the woods.
I was going to say the commune that I lived on for several years back in the 70s was called the Lighthouse Ranch, and it was on a hillside or cliff or whatever overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and actually had a lighthouse on it. And so a good friend of ours put a picture of that was pretty famous among us anyhow, of the Lighthouse Ranch, an aerial view showing the lighthouse, and behind it is Godzilla coming up over the
cliff. Jim, I have a very unclear memory, but I do remember visiting Lighthouse Ranch with Lori for 2 days. And I don't remember the year. It would have been 77, 78.
Okay.
Were you there then?
I may have been out there. I was there in 77. By 78, I think I had moved into town, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. We may have crossed paths there too. Just
one of the reasons your memory is so unclear is because it was foggy over the ranch every day of every year. So it's the Humboldt fog. That's why it's unclear.
Yeah, you may have been there, Michael, but it's not for certain.
Yeah.
you may have been in Fort Bragg. You may have been in Humboldt.
Been anywhere, man. By that time, we were just tripping driving through Humboldt County.
Yeah.
on the way to what was it? Bend, Oregon, where there was another Christian community there we hung out with, and I can't remember their name.
Might have been Shiloh.
Yeah,
I know remember. Shiloh was somewhere up there in Oregon. Yeah,
that was yeah.
Anyhow,
okay. Wow, this leads talking about all the communes during the Jesus People movement stuff. This goes right into what we were going to talk about today, because we were going to pick up from what we were talking about last week, and we concluded last week's podcast starting to talk about why is it that so many people who are really like big in the Jesus People movement or in evangelical circles, there's this big movement. That might be the wrong term, but there's a big move for a lot of people over to liturgical forms of Christianity. And we started to talk about, why is that happening? So we thought it'd be cool to open up today with what's going on? What is the appeal that in the last podcast, you guys were talking about how that was so like you were moving away from that kind of stuff with the Jesus People movement, the forms of religion you guys consider dead and, were very traditional. And then now we see this movement and starting like a decade ago or so, a movement back to that. I mean, we have even people like the Bible Answer Man, Hank Hanegraaff, he when became became Orthodox. Yeah. So, and I know some other people who were pastors in evangelical churches who went over and became Orthodox. So
sure. Our friend Frankie Schaefer.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you guys think is the appeal with that? Why is that happening?
Well, before I get into what I think the appeal of it was, let me give a little bit of a background. The Jesus People movement was a I don't know how to explain it, but and you almost have to be charismatic to understand some of the terms I might use, but it was just a sudden movement. It was like a generation, and it seemed like God just dropped on that generation. I had experiences that I barely said anything. I had a Christian T-shirt on, or in one case, I had a bumper sticker on my car, and I got flagged down, and people were like, "We're reading your bumper sticker," and it's like, "Tell us about that," And it was just, words like "sovereign move" and things like that have been used to try and describe it, and who's, I don't understand all of it, but nonetheless, the vast majority of that generation were brought into strongly evangelical churches that believed that there was a point of salvation that centered around a prayer, a confession of sorts, and whatever, and that the scripture, how will they believe unless they hear? How will they hear unless there be a preacher? How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those that preach the gospel, and so we go everywhere and we take this gospel everywhere, and that was wonderful because as a young person, I think I was 19 at the time, we had this philosophy of, in our hippie years, that we had no permanent dwelling place anyhow. And so when we heard that, well, that's right, Jesus's philosophy, it's like, well, that's cool. It's like I get to go everywhere, all over the world, and I'm fulfilling the Great Commission, to preach the gospel everywhere, which isn't the commission. It's make disciples, but we kind of interpreted it our own way. And get people saved, and so it's like, okay, now that you're saved, now join a commune, and let's live the hippy dippy Christian life, and let's love everybody, and peace and harmony. And it was good for a while until until our humanity kind of hit the surface. They talk about in evangelical circles about the honeymoon experience, right after you first get saved, and you're everything is beautiful in its own way, and you're skipping down the lane singing, this is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it, and everything is beautiful. But for a lot of people, there wasn't a lot of substance there. There was the personal relationship, which at some time on this podcast, I think we need to discuss that topic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll call it the myth of the personal relationship with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But there was that. Then there was the communal relationship that we didn't really understand the value of community, just communal. And
Huh.
go to church, have a wonderful experience, waving your flags and dancing and playing your tambourine, and everything was beautiful in that, except that there seemed to be something missing. And I think now, almost 50 years later, looking back at people like Jack Sparks, uh, Mike, you mentioned Frankie Schaefer. I know when he
Mm-hmm.
began to veer away from his father's faith, if you will, um,
Mm-hmm.
every mudslinging term was used of
Oh,
how backslidden the
oh,
man was and how he had denied the
oh.
faith and so on and so forth. And
He
I
Wow.
was
think some of
disappointed.
the same things were said about Jack Sparks and others.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was more. I don't understand it. I don't understand why they would do that. Why they'd go backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
Michael, you could maybe pick it up from there. But my conclusion 50 years later is I don't think they went backwards at all. I think they really went forward. And I wish a lot more of us would have followed them a lot sooner. I'll leave it at that for a minute.
Well, I'm just in 1,000% concurrence with your description of the Jesus movement because, we've already established, you and I were both there in the same Jesus movement, and that's pretty rare in a sense. I mean, it's a kind of a stroke of luck that we've managed to hook up here through Loren. It's been beautiful.
Yeah.
So I'm just in 100,000% agreement. You described my experience to a T. I mean, I remember when Jack started his move back toward first it was the Apostolic Fathers,
Mm-hmm.
and then through reading certain writers on the Apostolic Fathers, and there weren't really a lot of books out on worship in the early church in the 1970s. I mean, you had Oscar Kuhlman's scholarly pamphlet, CFD Mole had, but there weren't books that really laid out, as it were, the worship patterns in the early church. And so when Jack went back, for people like me that weren't Protestants, we were Catholics. When we saw that, I was very excited, and I was very pro Jack Sparks all the way. Even though there was a lot of opposition to it. Coming to today, so anytime, and we can go back to the Middle Ages, we can go back to the early church on this. Anytime Christianity becomes too rational one direction, the tendency is for it to move in the other direction toward
Mm-hmm.
what we would call mysticism or irrational. I mean, superstitious. There are derogatory terms for this. There are beneficent terms for this subjective experience, right? Okay. And when that is too heavy, then it comes back toward the rational, and it swings. There's this pendulum in Christianity that goes from extreme to extreme between subjective and objective. And then each of these pendulum swings develops movements, and one movement's very subjective, another is very objective. You look at Protestant orthodoxy, so hyper objective. Everything was about dry, dusty, boring doctrine that the need for self-expression, busted open on Azusa Street in LA. It was a need for what took place there. And as American Christianity through the mainline churches, as they were dying out, why were they dying out? Because us younger generation, we really didn't care about the nuances and jots and tittles of doctrine. It was boring. We were looking for life, and Jim so spot on noticed when he mentions, I forget the first point, and he said, but more than that, we were looking not for communal but community. That was precisely the heartbeat of the Jesus movement, was that desire for family, large family that was, I mean, it was, yeah. So that I would say that we need to factor that objective subjective swing. So we've seen what happened when Calvinism, in particular neo-Calvinism, through the influence of people like Piper and Driscoll and those fruitcakes, as it entered into kind of this American Protestant thinking in the 90s and then the first decade of this century. That's when all that stuff became popular again, and you had, the Rushdoony thing, and all of a sudden the Seven Mountains were back big time now with a neo-reformed emphasis, and that produced the subjective liberalism that we have today. Okay, liberalism is, and charismatic Christianity and liberalism are the two subjective expressions, whereas evangelicalism, in its more fundamentalist expression, along with anything out of Protestant orthodoxy, is this so-called objective expression. And the thing is, you cannot have authentic Christianity when those are split. They belong together. And so that's why when we were in the Jesus movement days, for me, I was looking for that deep, rich, subjective experience of community, but my mind and my tradition were calling for some kind of, there has to be a core to this thing somewhere. And I got very excited for that turn to the Apostolic Fathers. In fact, I was laid up from, I believe it was early September, late August, early September of 1980. And I bought that whole series that Erdman's publishes on the pre-Nicene Fathers. And
Wow.
because I was laid up, I read 8 hours a day, and I just plowed through those volumes for, about 3-4 months. Yeah. And I think that's due to Jack,
Um,
and
how were you received by your because you took you were reading the early church fathers and really taking an intellectual turn there? How were you received by your peers?
well, by that time, Church in the Park had unfortunately uh, begun its self-sacrifice, and it was when the shepherding movement came in. The dynamics changed between the three elders and the rest of us, and we were. This was, I guess, somewhere around in '79, early on in '79, I guess, because we were living in Christian community as well, and that busted that up. More than anything was the shepherding movement thing. People listened to me. I mean, I was a young Bible college kid. I've been reading Greek at that point for like 2 years, so I have a little bit of knowledge, which is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
I was a young upstart, and we did experiment with some ancient liturgies in our worship because Lori and I were part of a 4-person worship leading team, and along with Becky and Barb Woodthorpe. And so we experimented. I mean, we would go back and we would bring some of these ancient liturgies and type them up, and we would do them together, and it was cool. But then the next week we just might be doing, second chapter of Acts songs or something,
Right.
or the stuff that we wrote, or the stuff that Koinonia family wrote, or anything that anybody was writing in those days. It just got kind of passed around. All the songs that were being written got all passed around. Nobody was worried about copyrights or anything.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's funny because in that time I was a little kid growing up in a Baptist church, and a lot of the Jesus People movement songs made its way into the Baptist circles. Even they weren't used in the regular worship service, but like around campfires and places
Mhm.
like that, they were very much like It Only Takes a Spark, and all those songs kind of.
Oh, I've got one that circulated around Northern California. $25. $25. I'll bet you Jim knows this one.
What is it?
Oh, welcome all you noble saints of old, who now before your very eyes unfold the wonders of so long ago foretold. God and man at table are sat down. Do you remember that one?
I remember it. We didn't sing it very often.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, but mainly because it sounded too liturgical. It wasn't charismatic enough.
I love it because this circles right back to what we're talking
Yeah.
about. The whole trying to break out of that away from traditional type things, and yeah,
We
that's
we
interesting.
thought,
Um,
how do I say this graciously? Uh, we thought it was the miraculous love of God that the charismatic movement or renewal or whatever was hitting the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it was too. That's important. The
Well,
charismatic
it
renewal
was,
did
but
hit
I
big
mean,
time
our
in the
emphasis
70s.
was different. Our
Oh,
emphasis
oh,
was
okay.
amazing that
Yes.
Babylon is even getting saved. you know.
Yeah, right.
Well, it's interesting because even in my experience, even though I wasn't, I lived amidst the Jesus People movement. I saw the Jesus People on the street. I remember some Jesus People like doing carpentry at our house that I grew up in, coming over, and the hippies there, who wearing their crosses and stuff. So it was all around us in Southern California. But I wasn't. Of course, I was too young and I wasn't involved in it. But it's interesting because even in my journey growing up Baptist, I hungered for that experiential type of faith that was beyond just the rational as well. And that's, Jim, when I came up to gospel outreach, they very much still had that sense of family and community back in 1990 when I arrived. And so that was a tremendous fulfilled a tremendous hunger that I had. The problem is when I left there, at the time, gospel outreach had a pretty good balance between. My dad visited, and this is how my dad put it. He loved it, and my dad he goes, they're charismatic, but they stay grounded in the word like the Baptists. That's how my dad put it, because he didn't have the terminology or vocabulary, to
Yeah.
put it another way. But from his perspective, he was right that there was that balance that was taking place there, where you didn't just go off into charismania. But unfortunately, when I left there, I went to the other extreme, just like we're talking about, where I started looking for the experience. And then, of course, went way off into the ditch on the other side, got totally burned. But I didn't swing back to the other way. I didn't go, okay, now I'm going to go become liturgical, because that was, that's what the Catholics do and stuff. I wasn't raised around that. That was my thinking. So for me, it was leave the institutional church, because that was what my thinking was. This is the way to escape that craziness. And so I went on a season of the institutional church is the devil, and went to this kind of other extreme on that. And then but I couldn't deny that. But here was the thorn in my side. I couldn't deny that the place where I had truly experienced family and the strongest sense in my entire Christian walk was in an institutional church. And so that always caused me trouble, because it was like the thing that I was searching for when I had left the institutional church was back what I had encountered in the early 90s. Because that was a family that really walked together and cared for one another, and there was a genuine sense of community. So it's interesting, because that thing that you guys both talked about community, that was alive even in me and in my generation, who was still looking for that community. And it seems like now so often you see churches kind of know that. So they're always putting out this thing of we're family, come here. But it makes you stop and go, okay, so what is the ingredient then that's lacking that is causing people who are looking for that from being able to put down roots and go, okay, this is a place where I'm gonna, sit down and form community.
Well, I think you have a couple of things there that contribute to it. Uh, First of all, you have tradition, which is competing with heart desire, if you will. Um, Go back and Fiddler on the Roof. The younger generation is presenting to dad true heart desire, and dad say yes, but there's tradition,
Right.
and it's like, okay, so what's tradition? Okay, tradition is how we uh, function in our meetings. Okay, and in our meetings there is a certain order of service that we call it. And in my background, the order of service is, you depending on what time you show up to the building, you don't want to get there too early because you may be asked to help set up chairs or clean the Sunday school room or something. So you get there 10-15 minutes early, and that gives you a few minutes to kind of shake hands with a few people. If you're really bold, you might introduce yourself to somebody who's never been there before or something. But you usually want to scope out the room and make sure that nobody's sitting in your chair. Put your Bible and your purse down on that chair to make sure those chairs for you and your wife. And so now the order of service, you've got 3 to 5 songs. May or may not have what we call testimony or somebody sharing or whatever. And then whoever the speaker, usually at least 3 weeks out of every month, it's the pastor, the senior guy, going to get up and give his little message, his little sermon. And you know, and then you break up and you go into another room and you have coffee and donuts and you visit with the same few people and you go home. And you call that family.
I love how you forgot the offering.
Well,
Well, Jim never got any part of the offering, so
I'm going, when are we going to put the offering,
yeah, when do we take the offering? Or the 2 offerings if it's Mission Sunday or guest speaker or whatever, then you have to have 2 or sometimes even 3. That was rare, but anyhow, and unless you just happen to see them in the aisle of the grocery store, you're not going to see those people all week long.
Right.
And then you hear these terms like family and and whatever, and you hear maybe even messages about how we're living stones and we're being built together, a habitation to the Lord, and it's those things that touch that deep ingrained, I believe, put there by God Himself, need and desire and want to be family, to be community. That Mike talked about a couple of weeks ago, I believe, or maybe last week, about being interrelated, interconnected, interdependent, and that we're wired that way. And when we don't have it somehow in our heart, in our mind, we know we're missing something. But because it's not presented in any other way than a once a year or whatever message from the pulpit, it's not presented in living experience unless unless during the summer we do family events to prove that we're a family, it's like it's an afterthought, and a person can honestly live their whole life looking for something, not even knowing what they're looking for. And the Bible says hope deferred makes the heart sick. They actually have a sick heart, spiritual heart, not even knowing it, because they're not fulfilled in what they were created to be, and that's part of a community. And
Mm-hmm.
I think until we can get away from the order of service and find our way to the place where we actually function as community, where every part has something, not that every part functions every single week, but every part has its part in the play, if you will. And it's not orchestrated. It's an overused term, but it's organic. It's the way we live life together. Until
Mm-hmm.
we can find a way to get back to that, I don't think we're ever going to really represent Christ in this world.
Mm-hmm.
That's my personal belief.
Spot on. Again, dude, you are nailing it this week, man. Bam, 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 bam.
Yeah, I'm thinking that a couple thoughts, Jim. Is first of all, it's interesting because you hear um, pastors in churches they'll talk. That there is like a desire to have that community in a lot of places. Not everywhere, but a lot of places. You hear that. But as you were sharing, some thoughts came to mind. Is first of all is what you're describing. Um, Requires that I have to be hungry enough that I'm willing to depart from my, if you will, my comfy American culture lifestyle. Because right now it's like, just being brutally honest, it's kind of like, I've got my American life, I've got my job, I've got my routines that I do, and then I've got some Jesus on the side. I go to church on Sunday and things like that. But what you're describing and what you guys experienced in the Jesus People movement, and I got to experience some of the residue of it, was there was a hunger. It's only if you're hungry enough that you will go, I'm going to break out of this culture I'm living in and go spend time with my friend, go spend time with my neighbors, go spend time with my fellow believers. If I'm not hungry enough, all I'm going to do is have another program that I'm going to, like I'll have a home group and I'm just going to attend the home group and can't wait for it to get over with and go on to the next thing. So that's my first thought, is that the hunger for community has to outweigh my love of, if you will, of how Paul would put it, my love of this world, my love of the way things are and the status quo. The other thing I'm pondering is, and I want to throw this out as a question for you guys, during the Jesus People movement, because you hear that talk of in churches today still of family, community, we want to get there, and there's trying to institute programs and gatherings and stuff, trying with a good motive, trying to get there. But in the Jesus People movement, was there a sense of we're building something, or was it simply we're anything other than we're building the kingdom? But was there any sense of we're building any kind of organization, or we're trying to gather in numbers into this group or this organization?
No. I mean, we all wanted to spread it. We networked. The networks were very strong, but there would have been a resistance to any kind of unified organizing. It was hard enough when we'd get together and you could always tell which group decided to run the show because they did it their way, which was different than your way. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
you'd get to do a little bit, but they were running the show. Can I come back to your initial question about what is lacking?
Yeah. Yeah.
You asked me what is lacking, and that triggered. There are three things that I think are lacking in today's concept or understanding of Christian family together as church as family, or the brother sister kind of thing that we were doing. It would always have been Brother Jim. Brother Jim, how are you? You know. So I want to say the first thing that Christianity as a whole is lacking, as a whole, the whole thing, and that includes, everybody that's out there, is trust. And we've replaced trust with knowledge so that we're saved by knowledge rather than trust. Okay. It's only when we're able to escape this Gnosticism that we can talk about anything after that. But as long as you're stuck in that Gnosticism, you're going to be living in that dualistic reality that requires you to strive for intellectual certainty. So that's the first thing. Trust is lacking. The second thing that's lacking is equanimity. And by equanimity, I'm referring to the baptismal text of Galatians chapter 3, where Paul is using a baptismal text there that the Galatians would have recognized, where when you were baptized, there was this understanding that all cultural and social identity dies. There's neither Jew nor Greek, male and female, Scythian, barbarian, slave, free. None of that matters. That is all put in the tomb. And the new identity is that each of us are raised as brothers and sisters of Jesus and thus with each other, children of the Heavenly Father, like Lena Sandell would write. That created equanimity so that a master and a slave could be in the same house church, but over a period of time, that slave will have earned the title of elder and been over the
Wow.
master in the ecclesial sphere. Yeah, wasn't uncommon. And instead of equanimity today, what we have is hierarchy. And that hierarchy can be expressed as patriarchalism. It can be expressed as racism. It can be expressed as any kind of fundamentalism, any kind of wokeism, anything that puts people into categories of above and below, okay? Or creates any kind of us-them mindset. The third thing that's lacking is grace. Modern Christianity as a whole, does not understand grace. Grace is relationship without transaction. Grace is, I give to you because I'm a giver. You respond, you don't respond, doesn't affect me. I did what I do because this is who I am. But instead, we continue to go back to that religious principle of do ut des. I give in order to get. And if I give and I don't get back, I get a little peeved. That's why if I keep giving to God on Sundays, but God doesn't answer my prayers, now I've entered into that transactional relationship, right? And the same thing with human beings. We're on the worship team. We're up there. We want people to come and tell us how much they love to hear our singing. We expect it. If we're a great preacher, we expect people to tell us we're great. We have all of that transactional thinking going on, and because of that, we can no longer relate in true grace. If there was one thing about the Jesus movement that was important to me, it's that we really did try to live in grace and love and charity and peace, the fruits of the Spirit. I mean, whether you could say we were manifesting the fruits of the Spirit, whether you can say that we realized that was fruit worth picking, I don't know, but I do know that those gospel values became, for me, our lifeblood. Mm-hmm. And it was because I think we were starting to get grace and love.
That's really good, Michael. So many things to draw on there, but I think you hit the nail on the head on all 3 points. Because as you were talking, one of the things, when you're talking about grace, one of the things that stood out to me was, it was interesting this week, being a manager at a TV station and working with employees and stuff. I noticed that I was saying to Lily just in passing, it wasn't like this deep theological discussion or anything, but I just happened to say, compare it to, yeah, you know how people are at church about their seats. I was going, I had this situation at work, blah, blah, blah. And as you're talking, I'm going, isn't that disturbing that I can draw a parallel between the world and what I've experienced in church as being the same? The same attitudes, the same, and I'm not exaggerating. I'm not even going ugly on the church. It's identical. There is no difference. And I've got the same, I've got some nice people that really are nice and easy to work with. I've got people that are really angry and bitter. I've got people who are retaliatory. I've got people who hate change and will fight you tooth and nail on any change, So you've got it all. And you could even just take what I said and you don't know if I'm talking about my job or the church because it's in both.
Wow, all those shiny, happy people.
Exactly. And then we're talking about how the thing that I happened to mention to Lily in this conversation, I go, you spend time, fortunately, because I'm extremely fortunate to be friends with you guys and others who are being transformed by Christ. And you get around people like you guys and others that you almost forget how dark the world is, if you will, and then you get into the world and you're like, man, people are nasty to one another. People are hard and tough. But it's so important what you said, Michael, because if I can go into a workplace and I can go into a church and there's no difference other than the message that's being preached. One is putting out entertainment or news and the other is putting out, supposedly the Bible and the gospel. And yet the people are the same. That statement right there should be enough to make us all shudder. That's extremely problematic. Because it's like that speaks of, like you said, that the grace. And it's funny because we even have all these grace preachers and grace being talked about. And yet, when does this really become reality? Because the purpose of, let me throw this question out. What is the purpose of the church? What is supposed to be our purpose?
Well, let me ask you this.
Well, I was
just going to ask you this.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Mike.
You guys are like two cars at a stop sign.
You go. No, you go. No, you. Okay. I'm handing the microphone officially over to Mr. Dirk, and I am silencing my voice.
We have to roll the tape all the way back to the beginning of this thing. When the Lord said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell or Hades or will not prevail against it." We have to understand that He was not saying, "I will build my organization."
Yeah.
I'll set up my guys that will run it for me, and and it'll be a top-down organization with a CEO and a board, and and a finance director, and it was something completely different, and it gets back again to family. But I was thinking as you and Michael were both talking that, I remember when I first met you and Dave and Bob, and reading David's book and reading the book "So You Don't Want to Go to Church Anymore," and by Wayne Jacobson, and reading books like that and coming to realize that the experiment, if you will, to throw out, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but throw out all of the organization and the structure and the titles and the hierarchy and everything, and just get down to organic, or what I called for years relational gathering, where we came together just to relate. In the beginning, that sounds very exciting to a large group of people. It's like, yeah, that sounds great. But over a period of time, the vast majority of those people end up going right back to the institution. Or they go away from it completely. It's like, forget both of you, you know. And it's like, why does that happen? What
Yeah.
is that great
People want to be told
pull
what to do.
to go back to the very thing you walked away
I think
from?
people want to be told what to do. People,
Yeah.
um, they don't want to think for themselves, first of all. It's much easier to have the pastor say, this is how you're supposed to behave if you're going to live the Christian life, yada, yada, yada. And so
Right.
law, in this sense, is much easier than living under grace or living under love. If the just as it takes more courage to be nonviolent and forgiving than it does to be angry and violent, it takes more inner strength and developed character to love and be
Mm-hmm.
gracious and live in grace. You know,
Right.
we keep coming back to these foundational definitions. You know, we've asked, okay, well, what is grace? And rather than try and define it abstractly or philosophically or through a theological traditional lens, I think one of the things we're finally doing is we're finally getting back and gutting out how do the biblical writers use this word? What is really going on in the text is it appears that we have voices within the text battling one another. Well, what's the battle over? Oh, I see this, that, and the other. I want to come back to the gates of hell comment that Jim brought up the text in Matthew 16. I do have something positive to say. I've always been troubled by the Matthean version of the post Caesarea Philippi discourse because in Mark and Luke's gospel, it's in John's gospel as well, it's very clear. The disciples don't get anything. They are just completely clueless throughout the time of Jesus' ministry from beginning to end, and even afterwards, you know, in the early chapters of the book of Acts. They literally are clueless. And Matthew has a tendency to whitewash Peter and the apostles because remember, in the mid to late second century, there were battles between Paul and the Jerusalem church. That meant between Paul and Peter. And when it came to authority, one area could claim Paul, another could claim Peter, and that's not, so good. So this battle, for me, of course, leads to Matthew's gospel being written in Antioch in the last 2 decades at some point of the first century. And he's whitewashing Peter. So I do not take this text as belonging to the historical Jesus. Jesus never talked about the church, in my view. He had no idea about the church, in my view. He was a Jew, lived a Jewish life. He did not. Whether I don't know what kind of vision he had. If Bruce Chilton is right, he kind of had that Merkabah mystical vision of this of Ezekiel 1 and used that to develop. I don't know. I can't say. But Jesus never says this is what the future is going to look like after death. He never does that. It's always about the here and now. So I don't think the historical Jesus uttered anything about the church. But putting that aside, the textual Jesus does. Matthew's Jesus does. And I've always found it interesting, particularly back in the Jesus movement days, I will build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And we turn that into a defense. When we are attacked, our gates will stay strong.
Right.
But the text is saying when we attack, the gates will fall. So if you want a mission for the church, the mission of the church is identical to the mission of Jesus to bust down the gates of hell and set the captives free. That is not eternal conscious torment. It is the opposite. It is saying we're going into this bad doctrine, bad theology where everybody's put in hell or life feels like hell and everybody's miserable either now or then or both. We are the ones that get to go bring light into darkness, hope into despair, All of this is what we get to do. We bust down the friggin' gates of hell. There's a mission
Awesome.
for you.
Right. Okay.
And I'm not talking about some cheap Rebecca Greenwood thing either. Here, I'm not talking in the Seven Mountain nonsense and praying around cities, garbage.
Right.
You know what I'm actually talking about is shifting the underneath epistemology, shifting the mindset.
Right.
So, folks, we could end it here and then pick up next week and continue. I think we should continue this conversation about why why they make moves, in a sense, away from the persona side other people want them to have to explore their interior in other traditions.
So, well, we're about at time, you guys, and we think this is a good place to stop before we dive into some more content that we want to get into. So we're gonna stop here, and then next week we're gonna pick this up, and we're also gonna look at some things about how do you handle it when your own family or pastors or church friends are having some trouble with you going through what some people call deconstruction or changing your views on things. So we'll pick that up next week. So we'll talk to you all then.